It is the 4th of April, 1957, and in a flooded gravel pit near Sevenoaks in Kent, a group of men in overcoats stand at a respectful distance behind a low earthen bank. Rain has been falling on and off all morning, and the water in the pit sits grey and still, disturbed only by the wind. Somewhere beneath that water sits a steel cylinder the size of a small delivery van, weighing more than 7 long tons. Nobody watching would guess from the outside what it actually is. To the farmers who occasionally wandered near the perimeter fence, it was simply Ministry of Supply testing. To the small number of men who had designed it, briefed it, and now waited nervously for the result, it was something else entirely. The prototype casing for what may be the strangest weapon Britain ever seriously considered building. There is no warhead in the ground that day. What is being tested is simpler and in its own way more urgent. Whether the enormous steel shell can survive being buried, flooded, and detonated by its own conventional charge without falling apart. The stakes are not abstract. If this casing cannot survive the ordinary stresses of European soil and groundwater, then an entire concept, one born out of genuine desperation about the defense of Western Europe, is finished before it starts. The men behind the bank do not know it yet, but they are testing the housing for a nuclear landmine, a device intended to be buried in the earth of an ally's own territory and left there, waiting sometimes for years, until the day the Red Army crossed the border and someone many miles away turned a key. This was Blue Peacock, and it is not the kind of weapon that appears in the popular memory of the Cold War. There were no dramatic press conferences, no grainy newsreel footage of a mushroom cloud rising over a test range in the Pacific. Blue Peacock was designed to be buried, forgotten, and only remembered in the worst possible circumstances. The moment Soviet tanks rolled across the North German plain, and buried alongside its 10-kiloton warhead, was a detail so peculiar that when the British government finally admitted the project had existed, more than 40 years later, most people who read about it assumed they were the victims of an elaborate joke. They were not. Live chickens, sealed inside the casing with food and water, were seriously proposed as a way of keeping a nuclear weapon warm enough to function. This is the story of how that came to be considered sound military engineering, and why, for a few short years in the 1950s, some of Britain's best nuclear scientists found themselves debating the thermal properties of poultry. To understand why anyone would propose such a thing, you have to go back to the anxious arithmetic of Europe in the early 1950s. The Second World War had ended in 1945, with the continent divided, exhausted, and rebuilding. But within a few years, it had been divided again, this time along an ideological fault line running straight through the middle of Germany. NATO planners on the western side of that line faced a problem that kept them awake at night. The Soviet Union and its Warsaw-backed allies could field a far larger conventional army than Britain, France, and their allies could hope to match. Estimates varied, but Soviet tank divisions in East Germany alone numbered in the hundreds of thousands of men and thousands of armored vehicles, poised on the North German plain, terrain that was flat, largely unforested, and practically designed by geography for a rapid mechanized advance towards the Rhine and the Channel ports beyond. Western military planners did the sums and did not like the answer. Conventional forces in West Germany, Britain's included, were simply not numerous enough to hold that line if the Warsaw Pact chose to attack in earnest. Britain's contribution, the British Army of the Rhine, was a serious and professional force, but it was also small, relative to the scale of what it might be asked to face. Something had to close the gap between what NATO could field and what the Soviets could field, and in the language of the period, that something increasingly meant nuclear weapons. The trouble was that the nuclear weapons of the early 1950s were poorly suited to the specific problem of stopping a fast-moving land invasion. Britain's first operational atomic bomb, Blue Danube, was a large free-falling weapon designed to be dropped from a bomber, the kind of device built for striking cities and industrial centers, not for halting a column of T-54 tanks crossing a particular river at a particular hour. Air-delivered weapons depended on aircraft reaching their targets through contested airspace, on weather holding, on timing that a fast-moving battlefield rarely allowed. If the alarm came at dawn that Soviet forces had crossed the border, there was no guarantee that a bomber could be scrambled, armed, and over the right stretch of the North German plain before the moment that mattered had already passed. What British planners wanted instead was something that did not depend on getting an aircraft into the right place at the right time. They wanted a weapon that was already there, waiting in the ground, ready to be triggered the instant it was needed, and capable of doing something conventional explosives could never do. Not just destroying an advancing force, but denying an entire stretch of territory to the enemy for weeks afterwards through radioactive contamination. A 1955 policy paper on the subject put the logic in blunt terms, arguing that a well-sited atomic mine would not only destroy installations across a wide area, but would deny an enemy occupation of that ground for an appreciable period. It was a grim calculation, essentially deciding to sacrifice a slice of West Germany's own soil in order to stop the rest of the country falling. But grim calculations were the currency of the age, and the Ministry of Supply concluded that a buried nuclear mine, left in place and detonated on command or by timer, was worth pursuing. The task of turning that idea into hardware fell to the Royal Armament Research and Development Establishment, RARDE, based at Fort Halstead in Kent, the same establishment responsible for much of Britain's early nuclear weapons engineering. Work began in 1954 under the codename Brown Bunny, later changed to Blue Bunny, and finally settling on the name history remembers it by Blue Peacock. The engineers at Fort Halstead did not start from a blank sheet of paper. They took the physics package that had already been proven in Blue Danube, Britain's existing air-dropped bomb, and adapted it for an entirely different job. Not falling through the air at speed, but sitting motionless underground for days or weeks, exposed to cold, damp, and the risk of discovery, until the moment it was needed. The resulting device was enormous by the standards of a landmine, weighing in at roughly 7¼ long tons, encased in a thick steel shell more than 6 feet across on its side. It was, in effect, a nuclear weapon the size of a small caravan, designed to be lowered into a prepared pit or submerged in a river or canal along the likely invasion route, and then left. 2 prototype units were eventually built, and in July 1957, the British Army placed an order for 10 complete weapons to be delivered to West Germany, publicly described, for cover purposes, as nuclear power units for the use of British forces stationed there. The yield was set at 10 kilotons, roughly 2/3 the power of the bomb that devastated Hiroshima, a figure large enough to obliterate everything within a wide radius and to render the surrounding ground dangerously contaminated for a considerable time afterwards. Because a device this size could not simply be strapped to a test rig in a laboratory, Roddy needed somewhere to prove that the casing itself could survive real-world conditions, which is how a flooded gravel pit outside Sevenoaks came to host one of the more surreal moments of British Cold War engineering. Engineers watching a submerged steel drum from behind an earth bank, waiting to see whether the housing built to contain a 10-kiloton warhead could also simply hold together underwater. Being buried and unattended, sometimes for long stretches, created a second engineering headache that had nothing to do with explosives at all. If a device like this was ever going to be discovered by an enemy patrol, it could not simply sit there, waiting to be dug up and disarmed at leisure. So the designers built in anti-tampering protection. The casing was pressurized, fitted with pressure and tilt switches, so that any attempt to move it, open it, or interfere with the pressure seal risked triggering detonation. Firing itself could be achieved in one of three ways: a firing wire running up to 3 miles back to a friendly position, so that a soldier well clear of the blast radius could complete the circuit by hand; an 8-day mechanical timer, wound and set before the crew withdrew, which would count down and fire automatically if no one returned to stop it; or, as a last resort, the anti-tamper system itself, which was designed to detonate the weapon. None of this solved the problem that would eventually give the project its unlikely place in popular memory. A weapon meant to sit in the frozen ground of northern Germany through a winter, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, faced an obvious threat that had nothing to do with the Red Army, the cold itself. The electronic components and battery systems needed to keep the firing circuits reliable were vulnerable to sub-zero temperatures, and a mine that failed to detonate because its internals had frozen solid was, from a military standpoint, worse than useless. It was an undetonated nuclear weapon sitting in the ground for the enemy to find intact. Engineers first tried the obvious solution, packing the casing with fiberglass insulating pillows and blankets. But insulation alone could only slow the loss of heat that was already there. It could not generate new heat to replace what the German winter would inevitably draw out over days of burial. Within about 10 seconds of unauthorized interference, it was, by any measure, a device built to be genuinely difficult to disarm, which was precisely the point of leaving a nuclear weapon sitting on ground you might soon be retreating from. It was this specific problem, keeping the internal temperature high enough for the electronics to function without any external power source, that led to the proposal now remembered as one of the odder footnotes in the history of nuclear weapons design: sealing live chickens inside the casing alongside the mechanism, provided with enough food and water to survive roughly a week, on the reasoning that their body heat, contained within the insulated, largely airtight shell, would be sufficient to keep the surrounding components above freezing until the weapon was needed. It sounds, read cold on the page, like something invented for comic effect. It was not. It appears in the surviving engineering paperwork as a serious, considered proposal, weighed alongside more conventional insulation methods, as one possible answer to a real thermal problem that conventional materials of the period struggled to solve on their own. If you're enjoying learning about some of history's stranger engineering solutions, a quick subscribe helps this channel more than you might think. It is worth pausing on how this compares with what Britain's allies and rivals were doing with the same basic problem, because Blue Peacock was not the only attempt to put nuclear weapons directly into the hands of forward troops in the 1950s. The Americans, facing the identical strategic anxiety about Soviet numbers on the North German plain, pursued a different and altogether more portable answer: the Davy Crockett, a genuinely man-portable nuclear weapon fired from a recoilless launcher small enough for a 2- or 3-man crew to carry and deploy in the field, with a yield deliberately kept low, in the region of tens of tons of TNT equivalent rather than kilotons. Where Blue Peacock relied on a static device buried in advance and left to wait, the American approach put the nuclear capability on the move with the infantry itself, trading destructive power for flexibility. Neither the Americans nor anyone else, as far as declassified records show, ever seriously proposed keeping a nuclear device warm with livestock. That particular solution appears to have been uniquely British, born out of the specific combination of a large static buried weapon and a limited toolkit of period insulating materials. The West Germans themselves, understandably, were not consulted about having 10-kiloton weapons buried in their own territory without their government's knowledge, a fact that would later become one of the more politically damaging aspects of the entire scheme once it eventually came to light. Whether any version of Blue Peacock, chicken-heated or otherwise, was ever actually deployed to West German soil remains, on the public record, a matter of some ambiguity. The 10 weapons ordered in 1957 appear never to have been completed and shipped in operational form. The project was cancelled by the Ministry of Defence's Weapons Policy Committee in February 1958, only months after that order was placed, before full deployment could take place. What is documented with more confidence is the testing program, including the trial at Sevenoaks, and the existence of detailed engineering plans for the chicken heating scheme, food and water provisions included, among the surviving Blue Peacock files. What is not documented, at least in what has so far been released, is any account of chickens actually being sealed into an operational weapon on German soil. The project seems to have ended at the drawing board and the test pit, its most famous feature never put to the ultimate test of a real Cold War winter in the ground. The reasons for cancellation had little to do with chickens and everything to do with the same hard political calculations that had birthed the project in the first place. West Germany was, by the late 1950s, an increasingly important NATO ally in its own right, and the idea of secretly burying nuclear weapons on its territory, without its government's knowledge, weapons designed to detonate and irradiate West German farmland in the event of war, was recognized as a diplomatic time bomb in its own right, quite apart from the physical one. If the secret had ever leaked while the mines were in the ground, the damage to Anglo-German relations and to NATO cohesion more broadly could have been severe. There were also the more straightforward military objections. A static weapon, once placed, could not be moved to respond to a changing battlefield, and by the late 1950s, smaller, more flexible tactical nuclear weapons, delivered by aircraft or by newer battlefield missile systems, were increasingly available and did not require British soldiers to plant nuclear devices on an ally's soil years in advance and hope the geopolitical situation had not shifted by the time they were needed. And so Blue Peacock was shelved, its 2 prototype casings presumably scrapped or repurposed, its files stamped with the highest security classification Britain could apply, and the entire episode disappeared from public knowledge for the best part of half a century. It stayed buried in a bureaucratic rather than literal sense until the 1st of April 2004, when the National Archives released the relevant files as part of routine declassification. The date did the project no favors in the court of public opinion. Given the detail about live chickens, many assumed it had to be an elaborate April Fool's prank, and the National Archives found itself in the unusual position of having to issue a formal statement insisting that the story was genuine. Tom O'Leary, the archive's head of education and interpretation, told journalists at the time that it did indeed look like an April Fool's joke, but most certainly was not, adding, with the dryness that has since become part of the story's own folklore, that the civil service does not do jokes. The physical legacy of Blue Peacock is thin. No complete weapon survives in public display, and the 2 prototype casings built at Fort Halstead do not appear to have been preserved for museum exhibition. The flooded pit at Sevenoaks, where the housing was tested, has, in the decades since, simply returned to being an unremarkable stretch of Kent countryside. What survives instead is documentary, the declassified files themselves, now held and periodically referenced by the National Archives at Kew, along with the engineering drawings and policy papers that historians and journalists have drawn on ever since 2004 to piece together how seriously the project was actually taken. That paper trail is enough to establish the outline with confidence, the weight, the yield, the firing mechanisms, the cancellation date. But plenty about the program's finer detail remains, in the truest sense, still classified or simply lost to time, and any account of Blue Peacock has to hold that uncertainty honestly, rather than filling every gap with confident invention. What Blue Peacock leaves behind, more than any piece of hardware, is a case study in exactly how far a nation under genuine strategic pressure will go in pursuit of deterrence, and how thin the line can be between rigorous engineering and outright absurdity when the underlying fear is real enough. Nothing about the chicken proposal was frivolous to the men who wrote it into the design files at Fort Halstead. It was simply the most practical answer available, at the time, to a genuine thermal problem standing between a weapon and its intended purpose. That is, in the end, the strange power of this story. Not that the British government once seriously discussed heating a nuclear bomb with poultry, but that they arrived at that idea through the same careful, methodical engineering process that produced every other weapon of the Cold War, and saw nothing especially strange about writing it down. Return, for a moment, to that gravel pit outside Sevenoaks, rain falling on still water, a handful of engineers waiting behind an earthen bank for a test that would decide whether an idea born of Cold War desperation could survive contact with ordinary British weather. They were testing a casing, not a warhead, and yet everything about that moment, the scale of the ambition, the ordinariness of the setting, the sheer unlikeliness of what was actually being attempted, captures Blue Peacock better than any file in the National Archives ever could. This was a nation convinced it faced annihilation by conventional force, reaching for the newest and most terrible technology it possessed, and discovering almost by accident that even the most advanced weapon of its age could be undone by something as mundane as a cold night. The answer it settled on, however briefly, was neither triumphant nor especially dignified. It was improvised, uncertain, and entirely sincere. Blue Peacock never fired in anger. It never, so far as the record shows, was buried in German soil with its unlikely crew of chickens sealed inside. But for a few short years, it was real, it was funded, and it was taken with total seriousness by some of the sharpest engineering minds in the country. Sometimes the strangest chapter of the Cold War is not the one where the bomb goes off. It is the one where the bomb waits in the dark, warmed by nothing more than the beating heart of a chicken, for a war that, in the end, never came.